This video is for the lab for the polished ball collector, and I'm gonna go over for a few minutes on what the project was doing before we start modifying it. So originally we had, and I'm going to go into play mode right now, screen with directions, and then you could click on the start button. It would start the timer, and then you had to be of the same color as the different cubes to be able to destroy them. If you were to try and collide with another cube, it wouldn't work. You had to be the same color. So here with the red, and then finally when I collect the last cube, which I just missed, there it goes. It told me that I won, and then I could play again. It would take me back to the starting screen, and then the timer would be set back to 0. So that's kind of what we had before. My project might be slightly different than yours, since everybody worked kind of differently on this one, probably. I had in my assets in the prefabs, I had the different cubes and then the different paints. I think pretty much everybody should have that. In the scripts, I had the ones with the colors, the player controller, and the timer are the ones that might be the most useful to go over. Now again, your code is probably going to be different than mine, and that's okay. So in the player controller, I'm going to start from the top. We had a bunch of variables. At the beginning, we were setting the wind panel to be disabled. We didn't want to see that. And then also we wanted to make sure the start panel was active. And we got a reference to the rigid body component of the player. In the same way as we handled the movement with the rollerball tutorial, we handled the movement for the ball here in this assignment. And then we also did some raycast shooting there to pick up the color of the paint, basically. I'll go to the raycast quickly, which should be down here somewhere. There it goes. So here I cast a ray in the direction in which I clicked through the main camera. And then if I hit something, I check if it's paint. If that's the case, I read the color of the paint by accessing from the hit. I access the game object, then I access the renderer component, which has the material property and the color property associated with that. So I read the color that's on the paint item, and then I get the component renderer of the player, and then to the color property, I assign the color that I clicked on. So that's how I get my player to have the same color as the paint that I clicked on. That was what was happening in the update. In the other type of events that we had were the trigger enter type collisions. When here I had to compare if I were to trigger a collision event with a cube, and only with a cube, I would check the cube color, again accessing it using the get component renderer.material.color, and then I would get also the current color of the player, and then I would assign those to two different variables of the color type, and then compare them, and if they're the same, in that case I can collect my cube. That's a function I created. Maybe you had your code there, but I make sure also I destroy the cube. My collect cube function is relatively simple. Basically, it decrement the counter and then updates the information for the user interface, and then checks if I win. Here, checking if our win is just seeing if the counter is 0. Then in that case, I handle the win. And there, when I handle the win, I just show the win panel and I stop my timer. My timer might be a little bit different than yours because I set it up in its own script. But I figured I could change this a little bit. So the timer had the same information that what you had done. I have a timer text to display the time in the user interface, a start time, and then a Boolean variable that will let me know if my timer is on or off. At the start, the timer is not on, so I set is timer on to false. In the update, only when the timer is on, and that allows me to kind of restrict when the timer is on. I don't want it to start counting from the beginning. and when the game ends. I just want it to start when I press the start button, and I want it to end when I've collected all the cubes. So only when the timer is on do I actually update the timer and let the time go by checking the difference between the starting time and then the current time. At the start here, I created two functions, one to start the timer and one to stop the timer. The start the timer is going to initialize the start time to the current time, and then it's also going to set the timer on to true. And then for stop timer, I'm setting that variable is timer on to false, and then that's pretty much all I do. But these functions here, I created them as public so that they can be called from other scripts, which is kind of what my player controller is doing, and I'll show you exactly where I trigger these. But if you think about it for just a minute, I should start the timer when I click on the start button, and I should stop the timer when I win the game and I collect all of the cubes or all of those collectible items. So you can see here actually in mine it gives me access to the reference here, and I can see that in my player controller script, line 107. So I can go in the player controller script and go to line 107. And this is where I actually start the timer with the on start button click event. So that's kind of making a lot of sense. And I'll go over the rest later on. I just want to finish up with the timer. And when I win, if you remember, I have this function handle win. That's what happens when my counter is 0. I just get access to my timer here to stop it. How do I do access the timer? It's very simple. I have a timer variable in my script. That's a public variable where I dragged and dropped the game object. That's the timer. I access the script of that game object, the timer script, and then I can access from there anything that is public, whether it's a variable or a function. I can access those. So that's exactly what I did there. Not necessarily a requirement in the initial project, but I thought I'd go over this relatively quickly. So let's start by working on the generation of the cubes. If you remember, when we generated the cube, we selected a random position. We instantiated randomly a green, a red, or a blue cube. That was about all that we did there. And then the generate cubes was happening in a for loop. It was generating cubes one at a time that way. We picked a random number between 3 and 10 for generating the number of cubes. Maybe we could set that to be always 10 cubes, whatever the case may be. I'm not really interested in this portion. You can determine what makes the most sense for your game. That's more of a design selection than anything else. I'm interested in knowing what's going to happen with that time at the end of the game. So you were given a link to creating a singleton pattern. That is a pattern that is really useful for saving information from one scene to the next. So ideally what we want is to create a game object basically that's going to have a script on it, and we want that game object to not be destroyed when we are moving from one scene to another. The issue is that if you reload the same scene, then a new game object would be created, and then you would have duplicates, which would be a terrible idea. So make sure that you spend some time reading the information that was linked with this lab. I want to spend some time on just doing the code and showing you how to make it work. But that information there provided is really important for you to understand. And so our game object is going to need to be unique. We don't want multiple objects to keep track of the smallest value. Chances are we're going to have a mess in there. We won't know exactly which one has been updated, which one hasn't. So it needs to be a unique script in our code. And it's a relatively simple thing to set up and particularly useful This is the type of code that would be particularly useful in your 112 or 212 classes when you start making games and trying to keep information going from one scene to the next. So relatively easy to set up. So let's start working on this. In my project here, I'm going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to call it, I think it's supposed to be the global controller. There it goes. That's his name. I'm going to reset its component because I don't like those values there. I'm going to create a C# script, and I'm going to call it global controller because I think that's what you were required to do. And then I open up my script. So here is my global controller. I'm going to remove this code for now because I don't really need it. So a global controller is going to work in a very simple way. The main aspect of it is we need to have a variable that needs to be static. So let's declare that. We need to have it accessible to other portions of the code. It needs to be static, and I'll explain this in a minute. It needs to be of the same data type as my script here, and I can call it instance. Usually that's a common name for it, to name it instance. So the difference between a regular variable, like the ones we've been declaring before, and a static variable is that if I declare a variable, let's say public float speed, I'm not going to need that, so don't write it. This variable here, if I were to attach this script to different game objects, the speed for each game object could have a different value. Now, all of the game objects that have the script global controller will have that variable speed associated with them, but they will all have a different value, or they could all have a different value. They don't have to, but they can. And they're definitely stored in different locations memory-wise. When it comes to static variables are independent of the instances that have been instantiated. So they're independent of the game objects you attach the script to. And so regardless of the number of scripts attached to different game objects, the value of the instance variable, because it is static, is always the same for all of the game objects. So that's a big difference. It becomes quite useful here because our game object is going to be unique, but it's also making it easy to access it, and that's where the beauty of the singleton pattern comes in, using that static variable there. It makes it so easy. You don't have to look for a game object with a name. You don't have to do anything. You can just use instance dot in other scripts. So that makes it really convenient. But we need to kind of initialize that variable. Let me remove the speed here, because that was just an example. You've dealt with variables, static variables before. Color.red, that's a static variable there, and it always has the same value. It doesn't matter which game object you assign the color.red, they will all have the exact same color. So it goes along the same principle. So how do we set up this code here? Well, let me take a second to type in that code first. So most of this needs to happen on the wake. Why? Because the wake is basically happening before start, and it's a good idea to take care of the initialization of your global controller before anything else in the game is being set up. So awake is a good place for it. And then we're going to check what's the value of our instance. Because here, if you notice, I did not assign any value to my instance. So first I'm going to check what is the value of my instance here. And if I have never played the game, this is my very first time, then instance was never assigned a value, and therefore it's null. So if that's the case, this is the very first time the global controller is active. So in that case, I'm going to assign this particular object that has this particular global controller, I'm going to assign that value to the instance using the keyword this. This is basically a reference to the current script that is the first one instantiated for the global controller. And then the next thing that I need to do for this is to make sure that it doesn't get destroyed. So here I use the don't destroy on load. And then I'm going to not destroy the game object that's associated with the script. So that's great. Now, once I have initialized the instance, I need to make sure I never get a duplicate. So I'm going to have another if statement here, and that will be the last one because that's my only two options there. So what if instance is not null? When I get to the second condition here, because I'm using an else if, instance is not null. That means it was already assigned a script attached to a game object in the scene. So if it's not null, I need to check, well, is it something different than myself? So I'm another game object, maybe with a global controller script on it. And then if I check the value of instance and the value is not the same as my own reference, that means I'm a duplicate. So in that case, we need to destroy it. We cannot afford to have a duplicate in the singleton pattern. And that will only cause a mess if we did. It will call the functions multiple times, basically. That's kind of like the concern there. So again, if the global controller has never been found in the scene before, instance is going to have the value null because it was never initialized. So in that case, I assign a reference to the script that was first found by using the keyword this, and I make sure also I don't destroy the game object that was associated with that. The other possibility is that I get duplicates created when I reload the same scene. That happens. You'll have the one that you didn't destroy from the previous time, and then you'll get the new one. And when the new one will come around the corner, well, instance is not going to be null any longer. But when you're going to check its value, it's not going to be the same as the current script because it's a duplicate. So in that case, I need to make sure I destroy the game object. And that's about all there is to know about the global controller here in this singleton pattern. So let's make sure we save our script and then we go back to Unity. Make sure that you assign the global controller here, the global controller script to the global controller game object. And then when I press play, I'm not going to see much of any change, but I can see now that my global controller is under this don't destroy on load. I could play it and make sure that I don't get a duplicate. Actually, we could do a little experiment there. I'm not really good with these things, but hopefully I can survive. One more. And then I reloaded. I have one more that was hidden underneath. There it goes. I got me confused. And then when I reload it, I only have one global game controller. I'm going to show you quickly. This is not something that you need to do, but if I were to not destroy the game object here, I want to show you what happens when I reload the scene here quickly. It'll only take a minute. It's not going to damage anything. Unfortunately, you're going to have to suffer through me playing this game one more time. I have 4 cubes. One more. So there it goes. If I click on play again, it's going to reload the scene. So right now you can still see my don't destroy unload and my global controller here. But if I play again and I look at my scene, I have a global controller here for my scene. And I have a second one. That's the one that I won't destroy unload. So there is this duplicate that has been created. And well, I didn't catch it because I commented out the line of code to destroy it. But every time I reload my scene, I'm going to get a new global controller There's only going to be one that's going to survive because if you're looking at the code that we set up here, only when the instance is null do I set it to not be destroyed. So as soon as I assign a value to the instance, which is the very first time I find a game object with the global controller on it, then as soon as that's done, I'm initializing the variable. So all of the others that will be created when I reload the scene will be duplicates, but I need to make sure I destroy them there, and I wanted to point it out again one more time. That's a very important concept to understand with the global controller there. Also, that's something that's not particularly useful for this lab. But any game object that is a child of the global controller will be saved across the scenes as well. So if you have a project where you kind of need to keep the UI the same, I guess that's something that you could attach there as well. But you want to make sure you don't create any duplicates. That's the big danger when you reload the scene here. So you want to be very careful with that. You could do a lot of damage if you're not careful on how to use the global controller. So our global controller, let's get back on track here for a few minutes, is going to be responsible for tracking just one value, which is going to be the shortest time. So that's going to be, if you're looking in the timer, my time here is basically a float. So that's what my global controller is going to need to keep track of. And I'm going to need to have it public so I can access it. All right, now that's kind of set up. That's the one that we're going to assign at the end of the game. So maybe on awake, I could initialize this value. I'm going to pick a negative number because, and I'm going to only initialize it once. So if I know that my time is negative, then that means I've never assigned to it the shortest time. So that'll be happening the first time I play the game, basically. Next, I'm going to create a function. I'm going to create it in my global controller, and it's going to basically check if I have a shorter time to record. Alright, so we're going to need to have it public because it's going to be called from somewhere else. It won't need to return anything. And then I need to pick a name for it. So the purpose of this function is going to be to get the time and check if it's the shortest time. If it is, then we're going to set the shortest time to the time that we just got that is now shorter. And otherwise, we don't do anything. So I guess we can say update shortest time. That would be a good name for it. And then we would need to kind of know what's the current time. So here we're going to provide a float as an argument for the function. So it's going to take a parameter of the float data type, and then we can give it a name. We're just going to call it time. And time could be actually, we're going to call it game time. There it goes. That makes a little bit more sense there. So if we have the shortest time here equals to or less than 0, how about that? So that means this is my shortest time ever. I don't want to do something like this, so I'm going to put it in the else if. But if I do shortest time is greater than game time. So if I don't have this portion here, if I skip this part, then shortest time is -1. It'll be never greater than the game time because the game time is going to be a positive number. That's why I'm checking first. Is my shortest time less than 0? If that's the case, that means this is the first time I played the game, so I can just assign to shortest time the game time. And then I have the second case. Now, shortest time is not less than 0. So that means I recorded some information there from a previous game. And if it is more than the current game where I'm calling the function for, then in that case, shortest time becomes the game time. So that's about all really there is to do. The last portion will be to update that value, but we'll deal that somewhere else to put it in the user interface. Basically, we're going to do that somewhere else. So that's a good function there. Let's try and figure out where should we call that function. So we should call this update shortest time function whenever we are getting to the end of a game and we have a new time for it. So that happens to me in the timer script. It might be happening in your player controller script, but basically it happens when I need to get to turn off my timer there. And my timer is actually being called to stop right here into my handle win function. So because I have that set up in two different scripts, my player controller does not really have access to the time. So I could make this a public variable and access it, or I can just call my function up here. I think I'm just going to settle with the time being handled in the timer. It kind of makes sense anyway. So when I turn off my timer is whenever my game is over, and in that case I can define a variable, final time maybe for this particular game. That will be the start time, well, the time.time minus the start time. That gives me, I won't have the nice minutes and seconds displayed. I can reuse that information later on. Right now I'm just going to use the information. This is the information I'm going to record there. And then I can call the global controller and the update time because that's the end of the game. And so what we want to do here is very simple for calling the global controller. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the global controller name of the script here, .instance, and then I can access anything in that script. So if you remember, I had created that update shortest time function there, and it gives me access to the variables if I wanted to. If I needed to access methods like this one, I can do that just using the name of the script .instance, and that's because instance is a static variable. Now, of course, I've got to make sure that the script is in the hierarchy. That's required. But apart from that, it makes my work a lot easier when it comes to looking for the global controller object. So there it goes. That updates my shortest time at the end of the game. That's great. I could display it in the console here, maybe. Let's do a console. Oh, it's not console. I'm thinking JavaScript there. Debug.log, and let's display shortest time. And then we can just display shortest time, that variable there. Hopefully I'll get to play the game in a way that will be a little faster. I'm going to give myself fewer cubes to make it easier. So instead of going all the way to 11, I'm going to go to 5. No, you didn't see any of that. That's just to go a little faster there. So if I go into Unity and test this out, hopefully in the console I'll see my updated times when I'm done. So in the start here, I'm going to have to change those or destroy 4 cubes. Trying to rush through things, of course I'm going to mess them all up. And then the last one is red. Target shortest time 19 something, whatever, it's a big number. It doesn't really matter. We'll have the nicer formats later on when we put it in the user interface, but let's try this again. So if I play, and of course I've got just as many cubes as I can get. Ideally, I would want to try and beat those 19 seconds. This doesn't look very good for me. Trying a different strategy. I went a little faster and my shortest time went to 15 seconds. Now I'm going to try to take longer. Well, it's not going to be that difficult. So I'd like to take longer than 19 seconds so I can see that the shortest time is actually not being recorded or is not being modified. There we go, we're above 20. And you can see my shortest time remained 15 something seconds. So it seems to be working as expected. Now I have to be concerned with how I'm going to display that information since it's kind of working from scene to scene as expected. So the first thing I'm going to need to do in Unity is to add another text object in my canvas in order to be able to display the shortest time. So here I'm going to call this text shortest time text, and that will work. I'll use a format similar to the other one. Let's try and set it up similar to my timer text here. I'm going to place it right underneath it. This way they're all together. I guess it'll be kind of like high score. I'm going to type in high score. So I'm going to make that bigger. I think I picked 36 before. I'm going to anchor that to the top middle, kind of like how I did for the timer. I'm going to place it below that. So I'm not sure if I went up or down. I just went down. It's in the proper location. The thing is my box is too small, so let's make it 200 by 50. There it goes. I want my text to be centered, and I also want it to be white. It'll pop out a little bit better. Okay. I think that looks just fine there in the game view. Maybe it's a little low. I guess that's a little bit better. Alright, so you can set that up in the way that you would want it to be. That doesn't really matter at this point. So I've had the time being handled by my timer here. I could have my player controller also deal with it. At this point, it's not really critical. Let's do the player controller because that's probably where you have your timer set up anyway. So maybe that'll be a little closer to what you have. So along with my count text here, I'm going to have, you probably would have also your text for the timer. Mine is with the timer script. There goes. I'm setting up my variable, saving. I'm going to initialize it right away. So if I select my player, I should have that text that shows up, and I assign it right away. So what I want to do is basically at the start of each game, I want to display the new high score. So I'm going to pop up my script here again. What happens at the start of every game? Well, that's happening in the start, I guess. That would be one place. But at the start, I have my start panel, and I don't really get to see the information. I'll see it when the panel disappears. Or maybe I can just display it and update it on the start button click here. because that's exactly the time where I start my timer and I start updating all that information. So this looks like that would be a good place for it. We can test it out, and if we don't like it, we can place it somewhere else. So what exactly do we need to do just then and there? Well, I just need to set my text here to display the shortest time. Now I might have to check if that shortest time is negative, because in that case that means it's the first time I placed the game, so I may have to display a different text here. If you remember from the code here, this is kind of like what we had for displaying it correctly. So I'm going to kind of copy this and then place it in the controller here. So we are going to deal with display the shortest time. That's kind of our plan. So first of all, I need to get it. So I'm going to declare a float. I'm going to use t because that's what I had before. That makes my life a little easier. And then we are going to access the shortest time of the global controller. So global controller dot instance dot and then shortest time. Look at that. It's available for me. Anything that's public I can access that way. And then I can use this. I have the minutes and the seconds that are being calculated in the same way that you did for the timer before, no changes. And then I can display that information in the same way that I did over here. So I have to check first. Let's do this. Let's do this over here. So if t is less than 0, that means I have no shortest times just yet. So what I'm going to do in that case, I'm going to set my shortest time text no high score, maybe. So that'll be the first time. And then after that, when I actually have a shortest time, in that case I can use this code here. Let me just put this one. First I calculate my minutes and my seconds, and then here I'm going to set my shortest time text to display that information there. Ooh, and let me not forget the dot text. That could be a bit of an issue there. All right, I think that's pretty much it. All I need to do there. Let me go back over this because I kind of did a lot of copying and pasting. So when I click the start button is when my game area is going to be visible. And so when that happens is going to be the time where we can set up our timer to show the shortest time that was stored from a previous gameplay. When that happens, if my time that has been stored as the shortest time is less than 0, that means this is the first time I played the game, so I don't have any high score. But if it's not less than 0, in that case I have a high score, and in that case I display it in the same way that you've displayed it before for your timer as it runs. So no changes there, except that that value is not going to change, it's going to be fixed. Next time the game comes around, I'm going to have the same start button that's going to be clicked. So technically it should work. But for sure we need to find out. So we need to play. And let's test it out. I'm going to have to suffer through playing this game a few more times. There it goes. So I'm going to only have 3 this time. What do you mean? Okay, let's pick the blue and another blue. It's going to be a tough one to beat, but I won. That's great. 1040, that was kind of what I had before, and it probably will remain that value because I don't think I can beat that. Maybe I can. There we go, play again, start, and now it's 856. So it really gives me the new value that has been stored. One little thing that I did not check is what it says when I played the first time. No high score. My high score is actually truncated there because my text box is not big enough. So let's fix that quickly because that doesn't look good. I'm going to put a width of 300 and let's try it the first time to make sure that no high score. There it goes. I kind of like the idea of it working that way. I think that's pretty much all that we needed for this. Let me test it out a couple times to make sure I don't have any weird things happening after the second or third time I play. So I won. That's great. It says here 15 seconds in my console. I kept that information. That's kind of useful. And then it shows me the same value here. I'm going to try to beat that. With the blue ones, I have 2 more. I missed it. It's going to be close, but I beat it at 13:20. And there it is. Now I can go way over. Well, of course, it's going to be an easier one. Maybe I can beat it. One more time. There it goes. This time I went 9 seconds. Wow! Can you believe this? It's amazing. Now I can take my time because I want actually to take longer than those 10 seconds. And actually I did it without doing it on purpose because it was a little slow. So this time I did not beat the record. I went way above, but my record stayed at 984. So that's great. It kind of works out pretty nicely. I think that's about all that we were required to do in here. Nothing too fancy. Make sure you save that and submit your work. And that is it for this live. You have a good one.